In this video, we are going to discuss on the topic impact of First World War on early 20th century literature. Introduction. The Great War, which took place between 1914 to 1918, shook the very foundation of Western world. Literature during the Great War often reflects upon and wittingly criticizes the horrors of war. Many social, political, and economic shifts occurred during the war. Writers of the time felt the need to speak out against the flaws they saw in their society, sometimes even while fighting for their lives in their trenches. Literature became a common way for the British soldiers to express the reality of war. Women and men alike turned to writing as a means of emotional outlet. Before getting into the topic, let's check the factors that led to First World War. World War I began after the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by South Slav nationalist Gavrilo Princip on June 28, 1914. It was one of the largest and deadliest wars in the history. It's also known as Global War, the war to end all war. Approximately 70 million people died in the war. The main causes of First World War. The four main causes of the First World War are militarism, alliance, imperialism, and nationalism. Now let's get into our topic. Literature on First World War. One of the most heavily impacted cultural arenas to be touched by the war was literature. Literature became a common way for the British soldiers to approach the reality of the war, whether to express dissent against it or to simply understand it. Women and men alike turned to writing as a means of emotional outlet. During First World War, our literature got many poets who are known as war poets. The First World War mostly inspired profound poetry, words in which the atmosphere and landscape of battles were evoked perhaps more vividly than ever before. The Great War of 1914-18 exercised considerable influence on the poetry of Georgian period. War poets consist of two groups, one who sang glories of the war and one who showed the terrific side of the war. First group of poets who sang of the glories of war, patriotism, sacrifice, and victory. They are Rudyard Kipling, John Freeman, Thomas Hardy, Robert Bridges, Rupert Brooke, John Masefield, and Lawrence Binyon. Rudyard Kipling. Like many other writers, Rudyard wrote pamphlets and poems enthusiastically supporting the UK war aims of restoring Belgium after it had been occupied by Germany, together with generalized statements that Britain was standing up for the cause of good. John Freeman. He was born in London and started as an office boy aged 13. He was a close friend of Walter de la Mare from 1907, who lobbied hard with Edward Marsh to get Freeman into the Georgian poetry series, with eventual success. De la Mare's biographer Teresa Whistler described him as tall, gangling, ugly, solemn, punctilious. Memories of Childhood and Other Poems, Poems 1909 to 1920. Music, The Red Path, a narrative, and The Wounded Bird, The Groove and Other Poems, Prince Absalom, are some of his famous works. Thomas Hardy. Hardy was horrified by the destruction caused by the First World War, pondering that I do not think a world in which such fedishness is possible to be worth the saving, and better to let Western civilization perish and let the black and yellow races have a chance. He wrote to John Glassworthy that the exchange of international thought is the only possible salvation of the world. Wysakh's poems and other verses, poems of the past and the present, times, laughingstocks and other verses, satires of circumstance, moments of vision are Some of his famous works. Rupert Brooke. Rupert was an English poet known for his idealistic war sonnets written during the First World War, especially The Soldier. He was also known for his boyish good looks, which were said to prompted the Irish poet W.B. Yeats to describe him as the handsomest young man in England. First poet like Rupert Brooke, who did not personally experience the horror of war and sang of patriotism and nobility of sacrifice. The next group of poets who revealed the ghastly and terrible realities of war. Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, and Edmund Blunden. Siegfried Sassoon, English poet, writer, and soldier, decorated for bravery on the Western Front. He became one of the leading poets of the First World War. His poetry both described the horror of the trenches and satirized the patriotic pretension of those who, in Sassoon's view, were responsible for a jingoism-fueled war. Robert Graves. He was British poet, historical novelist, critic, and classicalist. The friendship between Graves and Sassoon is documented in Graves' letter and biographies. The story is fictionalized in Pat Braker's novel Regeneration. He published a volume of short stories, Catacroak, mostly stories, mostly funny, in 1956. In 1961, he became professor of poetry at Oxford, a post he held until 1966. Wilfred Owen. He was an English poet and soldier. He was one of the leading poets of the First World War. His war poetry on the horrors of trenches and gas warfare was much influenced by his mentor Siegfried Sassoon and stood in contrast to the public perception of war at the time and to the confidently patriotic verse written by earlier war poets such as Rupert Brooke. Strange Meeting, Greater Love, The Show, Mental Cases, Parable of the Old Man and the Young, Arms and the Boy, The Scent of Insensibility, The Sentry, The Deadbeat are some of his famous works. At last, Edmund Blunden. He was an English poet, author, and critic. Like his friend Siegfried Sassoon, he wrote of his experience in World War I in both verse and prose. For most of his career, Blunden was also a reviewer of English publications and an academic in Tokyo and later Hong Kong. With characteristic self-description, he attributed his survival to his diminutive size, which made an unconscious target. His own account of his experience was published in 1928 as Undertones of War. Conclusion. In the post-First World War period, the widespread social changes that ensued had brought a significant change in the field of literary thought. Socio-political issues now found a place in literature more than it ever had. These are the major impact of the First World War on early 20th century literature.